Welcome to the August 13th, 2012 work session. Work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on work session items. Tonight there are 5 items on the agenda. We may take one of them off here in a minute, but public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it in to the city clerk. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public comment cards will be allowed. Do we have any public comment cards? Can we see
No,
Chris?
no.
Okay.
I'm the clerk tonight. No,
All right, so the clerk's not here. All right, are you the clerk, Chris?
I am the clerk.
Will you
yes.
please sound the first item?
I'd be happy to if I can find it. Here we go. Discussion of defined benefit pension plan review. We'll let Sam make an introduction, I guess, and then he can introduce Mr. Clark.
Good evening. We're here tonight to talk about our defined benefit pension plan. Shortly after the retreat, Chris came in and said that there was some desire by the council to sort of have a second look at our pension plan, give us some insight into sort of valuation, long-term effects, and a more general discussion with a sort of different actuary. So we went out to bid. We brought in Chuck Carr of Southern Actuarial Services to do that second look valuation, and he's here tonight to talk about that. I'll let him talk about his background a little bit. I know that's the first slide. I've had a peek at it, so let me go ahead and bring him forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see if I can. I'm nearsighted, so it's like with or without glasses. But since I'll just look at my my own copy of the slides. Let's see if this is going to work. Yeah, I won't waste time. They'd asked me just to keep it to about 15 minutes or so. So I'll try to rush through and just hit the high points. You can kind of see for yourself who I am. I do serve a fair number of public plans. That's my. I do corporate and other types of plans as well, but my specialty is public plans. So I do everything from 2 of the 3 City of Atlanta plans, Atlanta Regional Commission, all the way down to lots and lots of small towns, mostly in Florida. That's where my smaller clients tend to be. I give you this. I call this disclosure. I purposely asked Sam not to tell me a whole lot about why I was here tonight, mostly because I didn't want. I want to be able to stand in front of you and tell you that I was given material to look at. I've looked at it, and I'm here tonight to share my opinion with you. But I have no idea who in the room, maybe wanted me to be here or thinks there might be a problem or issue. If there are issues, I have no idea what those issues are. So I'm really giving you a clean, unbiased presentation in that I'm completely ignorant of what your situation is as far as why you wanted me to take a look at this. And so I purposely asked both the city manager as well as Sam not to share any information with me as to why I wanted to be able to come in and be fresh, so to speak. Very quickly as a reminder, this is a defined benefit plan. The plan pays benefit that's formula-based. It's 2 3/4% of average pay for each year of service. Normal retirement is at age 65. Early is available at 55. You have a 7-year vesting requirement, and the employees contribute 3% out of their paychecks to help pay for the plan, with the city of Milton, of course, picking up the rest of the cost of the plan. This is fairly typical. I mean, you don't have anything weird as far as benefits go, which if you had something weird, I guess I'd be surprised, because you probably look to GMA, among others, to try to help you establish the plan, and so naturally they're going to lead you to something that's fairly mainstream. I want to share my philosophy just very quickly with you, and I know this for those of you in the audience. This is some of the print is small, but I guess for the city councilors, you've at least got it in front of you. Hopefully you can read your screen. Let me just share my philosophy a little bit on these type of plans. First of all, I think it's a mistake if there are concerns about this particular defined benefit plan and whether it's either too generous or not generous enough, or how it fits in with what you're doing for your employees. I think it is a mistake. I'll warn you against looking at this type of plan just by itself in isolation. And I have this conversation a lot with clients and with other cities that hire me just to do special consulting work. The pension, this is but one aspect of a total compensation package that you provide to your employees. you could have a city that has a fairly generous defined benefit pension, and there may not be anything wrong with that because they may not be paying as much in salary as other cities, or they may not have as good of a health plan. To me, you have to look at the compensation as a whole. And the real question is your compensation package as a whole, including this plan, is it sufficient for you to attract and retain the employees that you need to provide the services to the citizens? And that's the real question. So I'm not here tonight to tell you that your plan is too generous or not generous enough, because I don't have knowledge of what else you're doing as far as your whole package of benefits and so forth. So that's something that you have to decide. I mean, there are consultants out there in the world who will help you, who are compensation consultants who will help you design a total comp package. But so there's no right or wrong when you talk about plans like this. And nowadays, with all the political stuff that's going on out in the world, and we all heard about Wisconsin, where folks are saying pensions are too generous or whatever. So that sort of political movement is out there for certain, and there's been a lot of hype in the media about these type plans in particular, and are they sustainable and so forth. So I'm not here tonight to opine on whether these are good or bad plans. I happen to believe in defined benefit plans. I think it's a valuable benefit to have, and I think it's wonderful for cities to provide that to its employees. But whether it's too generous or not generous enough is something you have to decide for yourselves based on the whole picture. Just as a matter of comment with your benefit, your plan is very typical. I will comment because I was asked just to provide some commentary related to how your plan compares benefit-wise to some of the other plans that I deal with. I would say that the retirement ages are typical, other than in the public safety area. Public safety, we typically would see more normal retirement around age 55 in the 50s, because you don't usually want, normally you want public safety benefits for police officers and firefighters are usually a little more generous, especially related to retirement ages. They're usually a little more generous than they are for general employees, simply for the fact that you don't usually want to have, some 58-year-old cop trying to chase down, a 20-year-old punk, and pull him to the ground or whatever. There's a physical aspect to being a cop or firefighter. So it is common to see sort of two separate retirement programs, one that's specifically geared to the public safety area and one that's for general employees. I would say that your plan is very typical for a general employee type plan. It's probably a little less generous by way of the retirement ages in particular than what we would typically see in the public safety arena. But that may not be a problem for you if you're able to attract and retain, cops and firefighters that you need to do the job. You may have other areas, again, in their compensation package that makes up for that. The real question is, are you able to keep the folks that you want to keep? And that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And also the employee contribution of 3% is probably a little lower than what we would typically see for a plan like this. The 2 3/4% formula is above average as far as formula, but that being said, here you don't provide Social Security, so it's very appropriate what you're doing, in my opinion, as far as the 2 3/4%. But for the employees, paying 3% for a plan like this is probably a little lower than average. Okay, and all I can tell you is just a little lower than average, maybe. I would normally, especially if you did something richer in the public safety sector, you might have a lower retirement age if you were designing this from scratch. You might have a lower retirement age, earlier retirement for public safety, but they might also then be paying a little bit more for that benefit. That would be a fairly typical situation. Okay. Currently, and this is all based on your own actuary's report, so I'm just taking as given what I read in that report. Starting October 1st, your contribution rate, this is the city's contribution rate as I understand it, will be 5.31% of payroll, translates to about $289,000. I want to take just a minute or two to sort of educate you or whatever, describe what funding cost includes. It's hard for me to stand in front of you and ultimately make a recommendation or suggestion, which is what I'm going to get to in a few minutes, without each of you having at least some real basic understanding of what makes up the cost of a plan like this. Okay? There are basically 4 components. You can see on this slide, the bottom half of the slide, something on normal cost, which is essentially the cost of benefits being earned each year. So every time an employee works another year with the city, they earn a little bit more benefit. Their pension goes up. So the cost, the added liability for that increased pension is what actuaries call normal cost, okay? Then you've got, typically, an unfunded liability payment. This is where you're comparing the assets that have accrued to a certain point in time, and you're comparing that to the liability for benefits that have accrued up to that point in time. There typically, nowadays at least, is a shortfall or a gap. It's called the unfunded liability. And then there's a payment towards that that works very much like you pay off a mortgage on your house. So we're going to pay for new benefits as they're earned, plus we're going to make our mortgage payment for any unfunded past service liability that we have. And the two of those put together essentially makes up the plan contribution. Now, there's also typically an interest adjustment that takes care of some timing. You know, numbers are calculated as of a certain point in time, and the fact that contributions might come in throughout the year, there might be an interest cost or interest adjustment. Also, there may be an expense adjustment added, and that would be very appropriate. But the interest and expense would be a small part of the total contribution. The main contribution is going to be made up of normal cost and the unfunded liability payment. I just said unfunded liability is the gap between the accumulated assets and liabilities for benefits that have already accrued. Typically, and this is true in your case, the unfunded liability is not just a single quantity, but typically it is made up of different components. So each year, or sometimes every couple of years, depending on how often your program is valued, but every time the program is revalued by the actuary is going to calculate a gain or a loss. So let's just say we have, in your case, a 7.75% investment earnings assumption. Let's say the plan only earned 5.75%. It was 2% short in a particular year. That 2% shortfall becomes another layer of unfunded liability, or another layer of liability that's added to the unfunded liability, and it will have its own amortization payment, typically. And this is the way I believe Siegel's doing your plan. So you have an unfunded liability in total that's made up of different layers or different components. I call them source components, okay? And a lot of those source components are investment losses or investment gains. But each of those source components then has its own payment. Very much analogous to if you bought your house initially and then maybe you took out an equity line and then you took out another loan to add on a room to the house, things like that. And if you kept adding components to your mortgage and you had different mortgage payments, that would sort of be the analogy there. Okay, so one of the things that I want to touch on tonight is there are lots of different ways to pay off that unfunded liability. And it's not about right or wrong. It's more about opinion and sort of doing something that seems reasonable and so forth. But just like you could have a 10-year mortgage, 15-year mortgage, 30-year mortgage on your house, in the same way you can have different ways to pay off the unfunded liability. And that's a part of your funding method. The rule of thumb that I always recommend, and any of you with an accounting background, this may sort of ring a bell, but accountants typically, and the accounting rules, particularly those that are used in the corporate world, the FAS rules, FASB says that employee benefits, or the cost for employee benefits, really should be paid for over an employee's working lifetime and no longer. In other words, once an employee leaves your service or retires, you shouldn't still be paying on their benefits. If they've earned their benefits over a 20-year career with the city, then those benefits ought to be paid for during that 20-year period. And that's sort of a fundamental, basic kind of accounting concept that a lot of the accounting rules flow from. So in that light, then the unfunded liability, in my opinion at least, you shouldn't spread the payment towards that unfunded liability so far into the future that you end up paying off unfunded liability that was accrued many, many years ago when employees have now long since retired. That's just not, if nothing else, it's just not good accounting practice. But so my rule of thumb is that the unfunded liability should be paid off by the time each employee retires. In a perfect world, we would calculate and measure the unfunded liability, sort of allocate the unfunded liability to each employee. And we say, okay, Sue over here, she's got 5 years left, so we'll have her unfunded liability paid off in 5 years. And then we got Joe over here, he's got 10 more years to work, we'll pay him off in 10 years. That would kind of be in a perfect world. That might be a good way to do it. Unfortunately, it's not practical to do that. For one thing, we'd have to divide up the assets and allocate assets to each person. So it's not practical to track the unfunded liability by employee. So as a fallback, what we generally do, and what I usually recommend, is that we pay off the unfunded liability over sort of the average future working lifetime. Okay? So average future working lifetime can be anywhere, if you have primarily an older group, it could be 8 or 10 years. It could be as long as 12 or 13, 14 years. In your case, the unfunded liability, according to Siegel, is being paid off over an average of about 14 years. So my comment there is 14 years is probably okay on average, but it might actually be a little bit longer than you'd really want. And we'll talk about more about that in just a minute. Let me touch on something called the funded ratio. I put this slide in here because there is so much hype in the media these days about funded percentages. And the media likes to take pension issues and pension problems and to boil it down to a single number that makes for a great headline. Funded percentages, though, in and of themselves mean nothing. Okay? It's exciting to talk about, oh, this plan over here is only 20% funded, and we got one over here that's 100% funded. But it's meaningless. If you think about it, a plan that starts out from scratch, by definition, unless you dump a bunch of money in up front, starts at 0% funded. And then it takes usually a number of years for the funding percentage to build. So in and of itself, the funding percentage doesn't mean anything. It's like saying, can I afford to drive a Cadillac? Well, I don't know. What's your income? What are your other debt obligations? Maybe you can or maybe you can't. So it's the same way with funded percentage. There is no funded percentage that is right or wrong or good or bad. The media throws out this percentage of 80%. I've seen that in so many articles. Every time I read it, I don't know where it started some years ago. I don't know who said that. I've asked all my actuary friends, and actuarial profession is a small profession. We know each other all around the country, and I asked them, who said 80%? Who put that out there in the media? And nobody has fessed up yet. So we don't know where it came from. But I guarantee if you pick up a pension article, there's a pretty good chance somewhere in that article you're going to read where it says, experts say plans should be at least 80% funded. Well, no, that's not true. And it's meaningless. Your funded percent, by the way, I think was like 79, was what I picked up from your report, 79.66%. The other thing about funded percentages, there are a lot of different ways to calculate that. So an actuary can calculate a funded percentage for a plan that makes it look really good, or they can calculate a funded percentage that makes it look pretty bad. That's just because there's different asset values you can use. There's different ways to measure the liabilities. And so when you're ratioing those two numbers, hey, it's anybody's game. Okay, and I apologize. I'm just trying to keep this to a fairly short time.
Let me say this: don't look at the clock.
All right.
It's important. So
well, I have you all to sleep by like 7:30, no problem. All right, let me touch on some of the actuarial basics. Again, I'm sharing, some of this is just sharing my own philosophy with you. When the actuary brings you a report each year or every couple of years and says, this is what the city has to contribute for this year, those numbers that you see, all of the liabilities, it's all driven by assumptions that have been made. It's basically a prediction about what's going to happen in the future. When will folks choose to retire? How long are they going to live? What kind of pay raises are they going to get between now and retirement? What a big assumption. What are the assets of the plan going to earn over the next 30 to 50 years? All of these assumptions together result in a funding cost for a given plan. But it's very important to understand, and it sounds like common sense, and I say this, I teach classes a lot of times on actuarial theory, and I throw this out there because it sounds so simple, but the actuarial assumptions do not change the real cost of the plan. Every single pension plan that's out there in the world has a true cost. We don't know what it is until the last participant has lived out their life and drawn the last retirement check. Only then will we know, and if the plan comes to an end at that point. That's the only time that we know with certainty what the true cost of the plan is. The actuarial assumptions and the methodologies don't change the real cost of the plan. What they do is it's a planning tool, really, and it's to help you hopefully not have surprises down the road. It's hopefully to help the city fund the plan in an orderly way that doesn't destroy your budget. Hopefully you know up front when you put a plan in, and as you go along from year to year, you know up front you have some idea of what that plan is costing so that you don't get surprised 10 or 20 years down the road, or future city councils don't get surprised. So it's planning. It's planning and timing. That's the purpose of all these assumptions. So that being said, you can either use assumptions that give you a lower cost. We call those more liberal assumptions. If I were doing your valuation and I said I'm going to assume assets are going to earn 10% a year, okay, I'm going to assume that most of the plan is going to be paid for with assets, and we won't need much in the way of contributions from the city of Milton because the assets are just going to do bang up 10% a year compounded return. That would be pretty liberal. I mean, that'd be stretching it, right? So that's obvious. So you can use assumptions that give you a low cost today, but if you do that, the price you pay, unless you really earn, for example, what the interest rate says you're going to earn, unless things play out favorably, you're going to have an increasing cost over time. Likewise, conversely, you can have conservative assumptions where you say, let's not assume a rosy picture, let's assume something more worst case. That will give you typically a higher contribution rate today, but if things work favorably and you have overestimated the cost because you've been conservative, then over time your contribution rate either stays the same or it actually may drop. So any actuary worth anything can sort of approach your valuation from either of these angles or perspectives. Again, there's no right or wrong. I happen to lean a little more conservative. That's just personally, okay? I'd rather see, especially when I have a brand new plan being put in, I'd rather say the plan's going to cost this much up here on a little more conservative basis so we don't have any surprises down the road. And then, hey, if we go a few years and things work out better than we assumed, then the worst that's going to happen is the pension cost is going to go down. And I've never heard anybody complain about having their pension costs go down, right? So that's what I'd rather see. And in fact, the city of Suwanee, which is actually, I think, how Sam found me. I'm not their regular actuary. They also participate in the GMA program, but they, since plan inception, they put in their plan, I don't remember, 8 or 10 years ago, and they did that. They didn't just make the bare bones minimum contribution. We actually came up with a set of conservative assumptions so they basically over-contributed. They chose to contribute more in those early years of the plan. For the last 8 or 10 years, the stock market has not done well, right? The world has not been kind to pension funds the last few years. Most of my clients, the vast majority, their contribution rates have been shooting up because of those investment losses. Not Suwanee. Not only has their contribution rate not been going up, they're actually considering being able to reduce their contribution now. So they've just sat by whistling and everything's rosy, even though the rest of the world, has not done well pension-wise. But it's because they were conservative from the get-go. Okay, so it's not about right or wrong. It's about your perspective and what are you trying to accomplish. All right. I think I've already kind of talked about this. I drew an analogy here on this slide where I basically drew an analogy between pension funding and paying for life insurance. When you buy a life insurance policy, you can buy 1-year renewable term. So that's really cheap. You take it out when you're 25. 1-year term policy is dirt cheap, right? It costs you nothing. And then when you're 26, you pay a little bit more, and so the premiums just keep going up and up and up as you age. So you can fund a pension plan that way. And that's sort of how you guys are funding your plan right now. Maybe not quite that dramatic, but similar. Or you can take the whole life perspective where you say, I know I could buy insurance really cheap now because I'm 25, but I'm going to buy a whole life policy that gives me level premiums. So I know I'm going to be overpaying in those early years when I'm young, but I'm overpaying when I'm young so that when I get older, I don't have those increases in the premiums and I can still afford my policy. I'm going to have a level premium. So there's I just drew an analogy there between the two ways to fund a plan. So what's happened so far? From my perspective, and I don't have all of your history, but the limited history that I had, it looks to me like you started in the 3% and now you're up to 5.31% on your contribution rate to this plan. I also was provided some material that I think the Siegel Company had delivered at some point where it was predicted that you're either going to trend towards maybe 4.5% or 9%, depending on how things go. I would say I wouldn't be counting on the 4.5. You're probably going to continue trending up, and that's just because of the way some of the assumptions and methods that are being used in your case. Again, I'm not here tonight to say that's wrong. There is no right or wrong. It just depends on what your perspective is and what you desire by way of, do you want stability in your contribution rates, or are you okay with the idea of we'll start low and then we'll just kind of creep up over time? Because some folks are okay with that. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? All right. Let's spend the last part of my presentation. Let me just point out some areas, specific assumptions. I'm going to tell you what is being used for your plan, and I'll just give you my own thoughts, my commentary. So the first is the lower half of this particular slide. It's your interest rate. This is far and away the single most important assumption that's going to be made in the funding of any defined benefit plan. It's the investment return assumption, because believe it or not, when you get 30 or 40 years out from plan inception, you get that far out into the future, most of the plan is going to be paid for by investment earnings. It's not going to be paid for with City of Milton or employee contributions. And I think we all understand the power of compounding. So this assumption, as far as how quickly and how much are these assets going to grow, that is an absolutely vital assumption. And if you don't look at any other assumptions that are being made for your pension fund, this is the one to look at. Okay? So I've listed this as number one. Right now, the actuary is using 7.75%, and I understand that's something the GMA board sort of comes up with, this group of assumptions, and then you just get this report handed to you once a year. But I will tell you, you have a choice. You're not stuck with what they do. GMA will value the plan the way that they they're on using their standard assumptions, unless you tell them otherwise. But you absolutely, as a city, can tell them to do otherwise. And if you don't believe me, go talk to folks in Swanee, because that's exactly what they've done from day one. So the City of Milton ultimately can decide whether you want to accept or reject any or all of these assumptions and methods. So you could, for example, go back to Siegel or to GMA and say, Siegel is the actuary, I guess I'm assuming everybody knows that, but the Siegel company is the actuary for the GMA program. You could go back to GMA and say, look, while we appreciate your opinion, we have a different perspective. We want to be a little more conservative, and so we don't want 7.75%. We want something lower. I mean, you certainly don't want to go higher in today's world. My suggestion would be, and it depends on, well, I'll get to my suggestion in a minute. I'll save that. I think the 7.75% is a little bit aggressive. Let's just put it that way. Okay. Another assumption. The amortization method and the funding period. I talked about this a few minutes ago, that personally, and this is just my own funding philosophy, I don't think it's a good idea to push the funding of the unfunded liability too far out into the future. Okay? In your case, whether you have, on the surface of it, you have a 14-year funding period. But because asset gains and losses are being smoothed over a 10-year period, you effectively have about a 20, and they're actually being amortized, I believe I saw, over 15 years. So let's say that you have an asset loss, an investment loss in a particular year. That loss is going to be amortized or paid off over a 15-year period. When you then have come up with that loss by doing 10-year smoothing, you're effectively taking a 25-year period before you've really made up. So if in this year, if in 2012, the plan loses 5%, it falls 5% short on its investment, you're actually going to take 25 years as a city to completely make up for that loss. I think that's too long. Just my opinion. Georgia state law will let you go up to 30 years on everything. So nothing's being done here that violates state law, or that, there are some guidelines, there are limits on these assumptions. So I'm not here tonight to tell you that anything that's being done for you violates or stretches those limits. But you've got limits which says you can go up to 30 years. That doesn't mean going to 30 years is a good idea. Okay? So again, my suggestion is think philosophically about what is your perspective. Think about what you think a reasonable time period is, and in a minute I'll touch on a recommended cost method that'll kind of take care of some of this for you. But anyway, and by the way, I put at the bottom of this slide, I think the 10-year phase-in for asset gains and losses in and of itself is too long. I do use a phase-in method for a lot of my clients, but usually 3 to 5 years is considered reasonable. That's just because markets typically move in 3 to 5 year cycles. I mean, 10 years, unless you have a really unusual situation. I get that 2008 was a horrible year for most pension funds, and so in a lot of cases, those employers they need 10 years to recover from that, and I get that, okay, because we don't want to break the bank. But in the normal scheme of things, I don't think we need to be spreading asset gains and losses over phasing them in over a 10-year period. I think that's just too long. It's too liberal, okay? All right. On a positive note, level percent of pay, there are two ways you can amortize. You can do level dollar or level percent of pay. Georgia law lets you do a level percent of pay, meaning you actually have negative amortization up front, and you don't really start paying down principal on your unfunded liability until usually 10 or 15 years down the road. Okay? I don't like that philosophically. That is not what's being done here, fortunately. Yay. So the actuary gets an A for this. They're using level dollar funding, which is the same way you pay off your mortgage, with level dollar payments, and that's appropriate. Cost method, you're using something called projected unit credit. I'm not sure why that's being used. Apparently someone at GMA or Siegel thinks it's a good idea. You usually see projected unit credit cost method in the corporate world because the FASB rules required that. They required measuring the corporate plans using the PUC method, but you don't often see it in the public sector, so I'm not a big fan of it. In a minute, I'll tell you what I would suggest. There's two cost methods that I think you could use that would be probably more appropriate. Mortality. This gets to life expectancy. That's kind of common sense, right? This is a plan that's going to pay benefits to someone from the time they retire for the rest of their life. So what we assume for life expectancy is very important, because if we use outdated mortality tables, then assuming shorter life expectancy means we may not have saved up enough money to pay the pension on average for everybody's lifetime, right? So it's very important to stay up to date with your mortality table. Human life expectancy continues to improve, thank goodness. So the table itself that's being used here is something called RP 2000. That is, actually there's lots and lots of versions of that table. That in itself is entirely appropriate. Where I veer off of what the actuary is doing, they're actually assuming employees are a little bit older than they are. So they're assuming male employees are 2 years older, if I remember right, and females are 1 year older. Well, what's the big deal? What's a year or two, right? Well, what that means is you've now negated the effect of using an up-to-date mortality table, because you've just taken off a year or two from the employees' lives. So when you have something called a set forward, if you look at your actuarial report, you'll see they're saying they're using a mortality table with a set forward. What that means is someone who's age 50, they're pretending, if it's a male, that they're 52. Okay, so they're applying mortalities if they're 52.
Why would anybody even do that?
I don't know. That would be a question. That would be a question for your actuary or for GMA, and it would be a valid question. I suspect. I can tell you why I think it's being done. If you're looking at this thing only from the pension funding perspective in isolation, there is no reason to do that. That's crazy. I mean, you want to stay up to date. My guess is that they probably, sometime in the recent past, moved to this RP 2000 table. So they said, it's time to update mortality. Let's update it. And then somebody said, but wait a minute, that's going to raise pension costs. And we can't raise pension costs. We got to be careful because everybody's going to get upset. All the cities' budgets are tight. So my guess is that what they did was they said, okay, we'll go to this updated mortality, but let's ease into it. And we'll go to it and we won't really use it right now. We'll use a age set forward to kind of ease the pain, so to speak. And then probably their intent at some point down the road is to pull back and stop using those set forwards. But that would be my guess if I had to guess why they do it. Okay. Pay increase assumption, I'll just say, in your case, it looked like it was entirely appropriate. I think they've hit the nail on the head for pay increases, so I was glad to see that. Too many times I see actuarial reports where they assume low rates of pay increase in the future. If you think about the pension benefits to be paid from the plan are based on projected pay because it's a final average pay plan. So again, how much the rate at which you assume pay will grow from year to year for each employee, that's a very important assumption that plays into the cost of the plan. So you could say, well, we don't think pay is going to grow very much. You're going to get much lower liabilities than if you assume pay is going to grow a lot. So in your case, I didn't have a problem at all. Your pay increase assumption made perfect sense to me, so I was happy to see that. Other assumptions, things like turnover. What's the rate at which people leave the city? I mean, you're a young city. It's a young plan. There's not going to be enough experience with your plan itself to set plan-specific assumptions. In other words, the actuary is going to, by definition, have to look at sort of the world at large. I don't see anything right now that looks extraordinary. That being said, when you go a few more years and you have more experience, that would be a good time to ask the actuary, have you looked at our termination rates? That's the rate at which people are assumed to leave employment. each year. You know, if you looked at those to see if they're kind of lining up with what we're really experiencing the last 10 or 15 years, you know, but it's too early to do that because you just don't have enough experience. Okay, I said I was going to make some, and I call these suggestions, and I probably somewhere in here is the word recommendation. I can't make a recommendation because I have not performed evaluation of your plan. I've not gotten employee data and all that stuff. All I've done is review a couple of actuarial reports, okay? I mean, I can tell a lot from those reports, but that's all I've done. I haven't actually hands-on valued your plan. So I can't stand in front of you the way that your actuary would and make a recommendation. But what I can do is give some areas that I would suggest that you think about and that you certainly would want to ask the actuary or ask GMA about and say, you know, why are we assuming this or that? Should we be doing something different, okay? Interest rate, my general comment there is I would, if I were in your shoes, I'd be more comfortable with something more towards 7%. There's an argument out there in the world right now in the accounting profession where accountants are wanting, there's some new GASB standards, governmental accounting standards, that are going to require plans like this to be measured using very, very short-term, much lower interest rates than the 7.75%. That's not going to affect your funding. It's simply going to affect how you report how your plan is funded. In other words, it's just an accounting cost that's going to begin to look different than what your cash cost is. Okay, I think the accountants, with all due respect to any accountants in the room, I have a brother who's a CPA, so I think the accountants have sort of gone a little bit too far over in the conservative field because I don't think using a 3 or 4% interest rate is any more appropriate than using an 8 or 10% interest rate. I think something around 7 for most plans is probably appropriate. I think 7.75 is a little aggressive. It's not wrong, it's just a little aggressive. And that's a long road to hoe in today's world to earn 7.75% compounded year after year. I think you're more likely to see losses from one year to next than you are to see gains when you're doing that. Okay. The cost method. The funding method or the cost method gets to how do we deal with our unfunded liability and how are experience gains and loss handled. I said earlier, in your case, you have something called the projected unit credit method. That's typically a corporate method. I don't often see it in the public arena. That being said, my suggestion was I'm a big fan of something called the aggregate method. So if Rocky Joyner comes and stands for you, if Rocky's a friend of mine, we go way back. When Rocky stands in front of you and you say, we're thinking about the aggregate method, he's probably going to say, you've been talking to Chuck, haven't you? Because I'm a huge proponent of the aggregate funding method. And that's because under the aggregate funding method, all of your gains and losses, experience gains and losses, are automatically funded over the average future working life of your employees. So it just you don't even think about it. You don't have to set a specific funding period. It's going to happen automatically under that method. So my recommendation, all other things being equal, is aggregate funding method. There's also a method called frozen initial liability you might want to talk to your actuary about. That's sort of a hybrid between the aggregate approach and what you're doing now. But I would not stick with. Under your current funding method, let me say this. The funding method that's being used for your plan right now you're going to continue to see, unless you just have some bang-up experience, you're going to continue to see steady increases in your pension contribution rate. You've seen it go from 3 point whatever to 5.31. Just accept that you're going to continue to see that moving up, and it's going to ultimately get up in that 8, 9, 10% range. That's just my prediction. Don't mean to be the bad guy, but that's what you should expect, in my opinion. Mortality, I would suggest not using the age set forward, and you can actually use a little more updated mortality than you are. There are tables now that have been issued projected to 2013. You know, I'm an advocate of using as up-to-date mortalities we can use. I just think it's the smart thing to do, but one person's opinion. What will this do to you? Well, you've probably guessed already. Anything that I would do as far as assumptions would increase your plan cost. I don't think that's a bad thing. I would rather, like I said earlier, when you have a plan like this, I'd rather be a little more conservative and pay more today and not have the surprises down the road and be able to weather the storm that we've had with investments over the last few years. I'd rather be able to weather that and not even think about it than to be worried that my contribution rate every year is just going to go up and up and up, and how the heck are we going to pay for it because we've got other budget issues and we've got to try to fit this ever-increasing pension cost in with everything else. Just my opinion. So there is a way to do that. You can move to a cost method and a set of assumptions, I think, that will give you a higher contribution rate today, so it's kind of, you don't have to swallow that, but you can jump to a higher level today and have the very realistic expectation that then you're going to be steady state for a long time to come. Okay? And that would be, if you said, what's the one recommendation I would have, that would be it. What's that number going to look like? It's probably going to be 8 to 10% of pay for this plan. So when you look at your total pension program, and I don't have a lot of information. I know you have some defined contribution plans. You have, this is not the only pension that you're providing. You've got, I think, 3 different programs, right, or 3 different contributions that you're making, from what I could see. So right now, as best I could tell, the city's total pension cost is running about 10% of payroll. Does that sound about right? So if you followed my advice, your pension costs in total are probably going to be more like 13 to 15% of payroll. Now that's a wag, okay, because I've not valued your plan. It's just based on 25 years plus of experience dealing with plans like this. I would expect something in the 13 to 15% range overall. That's not bad, folks. Most of my clients would kill to have contribution rates in that range, okay? And when you think about you're not paying the Social Security rate, that is a very 13 to 15% of payroll overall is very reasonable as a pension cost, in my opinion. So it's not extravagant and it's not over the top. I do 2 of the 3 Atlanta plans. We've topped 60, 70% for some years on those plans. I've not always been their actuary, and I don't have the luxury there of being able to walk in and say, I think we ought to do this or that, because their budgets have always been strapped. So, their rates have come down somewhat. Now they're running about between 30 and 35% of payroll overall. But there are a lot of cities out there that are in the 20s and 30s, 40s on pension cost that would kill for a 15% of pay pension cost. So I don't think 13 to 15% is unreasonable, but I think if you'll move to that level overall, I think you should hopefully stop having these increases that you've been seeing. And so I don't know how important stability is to you, but the true cost of your plan long term is probably more in that ballpark. So, and then we come to questions.
Okay, can you flip back 2 slides?
I can.
Real quick. So
The impact slide or the
no, you were on the right one. That one right
okay.
there. I would hate to try to just boil down everything you said to just a couple of statements, but I'm going to do that anyway.
Go ahead.
So the total cost of the plan is the total cost of the plan. The real issue here is when we pay for it.
That's correct.
Okay?
That's
and
correct.
You're saying our current costs are roughly 10%.
Overall.
And they should be between 13 and 15% if we want to pay for it in a more reasonable time frame.
In a
other
level.
words, we don't want to penalize future years.
Correct.
We want to pay it now when it's
Yes. If you
right
said
time.
most cities want a level percent of pay cost. You'd like to know we spend 10% of pay on health insurance. We spend 12% of pay on pensions. We spend whatever, so that you know what your total package costs, and then you know from year to year if we bump payroll up by 5% or 10% because we've hired people or we've given pay increases, you know that still your total costs relative to each other are stable. And so what I'm saying is that from this point forward, my guesstimate is that your long-term overall pension costs are probably in the neighborhood of 13 to 15% of payroll. So that means if you're paying 10% today, at some point you may get up to 17, 18% or more. By the way, the longer you wait to pay it, the more expensive it gets,
sure.
which is common sense. Yeah.
Sure, but I guess and when you compare 10% to 13%, I mean, it's 3%.
Yeah.
It's not setting off alarm flags.
That's because you're
bells or
young
anything.
still. You've
Right.
only had 3 or 4 years at this.
15% to 10% is a little bit more, but still we're only talking about 50%. What disturbs me is that if you look at it as a percentage of what we're paying now, we're 30 to 50% off.
Right.
Potentially what we should be paying.
Right.
That's more disturbing to me.
Yes.
So. Okay.
Yeah. But
So I guess what you're saying, if we were to look at some of your suggestions and do some of those, it may raise us up to 13 to 15%, but that could give us a long-term level.
correct.
13 to 15%.
Right. To allow you not to worry about, oh my gosh, this year the stock market is down, we didn't make our assumption or whatever. It should allow you, and again, I'll use the City of Suwanee as an example. They're just a wonderful example of this because they put their plan in. They could have had a 3 or 4% of pay contribution to start out with. That's in fact what Siegel and GMA gave them to start. And instead they had the discipline, and I would say the good sense, to actually contribute. I think they were up 8-10%. Because I came up with, we worked with them, and we actually worked with GMA and with Siegel as well. I didn't do it in isolation. But collectively, we came up with a set of assumptions and methods that we felt would allow them steady state contribution. And so for the last 8 or 10 years, while everybody else's contribution rates have been going up, they've been able to weather that storm. They've been able to handle those investment losses without having a corresponding increase in their contribution rates. And now, actually, they're looking at maybe being able to lower them a little bit, which I think is a good thing. So, and I'm not suggesting going to Rocky or to Siegel or GMA and saying, Chuck says we need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so do these 5 things here. What I'm suggesting is that you have the conversation. Sit down with GMA, sit down with Rocky or someone from Siegel and say, look, we talked with Chuck. He had some suggested areas that we look at. We don't think, and Chuck didn't think we're being quite as conservative when we were a little bit too liberal. We'd like to talk to you about the cost method, the investment return, the mortality, and get Rocky's ideas. He may have a very good reason and may be able to tell you something entirely different as to why he's using that age set forward than what I said. I just am taking a guess as to why it's being done that way. So, I'm not trying to step into his shoes, but I think you need to have the conversation. And that's what I'm suggesting. And then, what comes out of it will come out of it.
You only did an analysis of our current plan. You did not look at whether or not it was the kind of plan we really needed to have, or if we needed to have a defined contribution method.
No, I didn't.
You didn't do any of that. You
No.
really just looked at our current plan and
Correct.
what you would recommend with our plan to make sure we don't end up in the front page of the paper.
Correct.
With all the other
But
cities.
I'm not shy about giving my opinion. I think the program that you have is spot on. The combination of a defined benefit, a core pension, coupled with the defined contribution that you've got, where you have a matching contribution, you've got kind of an automatic contribution, in light of the fact that you're not providing the Social Security, I think it's spot on. I wouldn't recommend any changes to your program. The only change to the design that you might want to look at, and this is only if you feel like it's a problem, is that in the public safety area for police officers and firefighters, the retirement ages for this plan are a little high. Typically, you would see younger retirement ages for public safety, and that's just because you don't usually want to have a bunch of 60-year-olds with all due respect. I just turned 50, so I guess I'm over 40. I'm allowed to. But, you don't want to have a bunch of 60-year-olds going around chasing down criminals. Typically. You don't want a bunch of 60-year-old firefighters. You want 25 and 30-year-olds doing that. Sorry, that's just the nature of the job. So.
But what about
You're not a politician.
I'm not a politician. You're right.
Yeah, what about administrative people in public safety? I mean,
That you can
Like
what
chief
some
back
what
there.
some cities do. The cities that have public safety plans, because a lot of cities have a separate public safety pension plan program, but a lot of times the administrators are not a part of that. They're in the what's called the general employee plan.
Okay.
Not always, but sometimes. So I'm talking about the everyday men and women that are out there on the street, going into the burning buildings, chasing down the criminals, that kind of thing. You usually don't want to encourage them to stick around till they're 60 or 65, because it's a physically demanding job. It's somewhat unique, and so typically the pensions that are provided in that area are a little more generous, either in the dollar amount in the formula, or certainly by having earlier normal retirement ages. So instead of normal retirement at 65, you might typically see normal retirement at 55. That would be pretty typical. So just by way of example.
But that would also increase your
It would increase your cost, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm not saying it's a problem for you now. If you've been able to attract and retain the cops and firefighters you need, then that's great. It means it's working.
And I guess that you made a point earlier, and you have to balance it with the whole package.
That's right. You have to look at the whole package.
If you get rid of the plan, you may have to pay more salary.
You might have to pay more salary. That's right. But philosophically, the approach that you've taken to retirement, just looking at that in itself, to me is spot on. Having a good core, especially in light of the fact that you don't have Social Security, you have a good core defined benefit, so you've got that. Because, defined benefit plans are paternalistic. They protect the employee's pensions. The defined contribution plans like 401ks, the employees' pensions or their money is at risk. You know, if they retire at the wrong time, if they retire after 2 or 3 years, bad years in the market, you know, they could lose a chunk of their pension. So I think it's great when you have the combination like you have, and you've got a core pension that is not at risk, where the city assumes the risk for that piece of the pie, and then you've also got basically like a supplementary, you know, matching contribution where the employees who want to save extra, they have the ability to do that. And that, you know, and that part is at risk. So you kind of have the combination. I think that's spot on and absolutely appropriate.
Okay. Any questions?
There are actually high risk between the two of what you just mentioned as well. So it's important to make sure that there's not an either or. There are things in between too.
There are things like cash balance plans. You may be thinking of those. You know, there are other types of plans that have that. Have features of both. That's exactly right. Yeah. You're in the mainstream, though, as far as what you're doing pension-wise. Today, I don't know, 10 years from now, you know, it could be a different world. Today, you are very much in the mainstream as far as what you're doing, you know, because you are, in a sense, competing with other cities, competing against other cities. So, and that makes sense, because my guess is GMA probably helped you come up with what you've got as far as plan designs, I assume. Maybe not. Maybe you just came up with it and then just went to them. But, you know, if they did, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, because they're going to help you to see what are other cities doing and that are similar to us. And so that's who you're competing with.
Okay. Any more questions?
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very
I
much,
enjoyed
Doug.
coming up this way. They've added a couple lanes since I was last up this way to 400. So
Appreciate your time.
good luck. Thank you.
Any comments or feedback from council or to staff, or do we want to maybe have our staff look at Chuck's suggestions and kind of get back with us and
It would be good
look
to
at
know.
other options?
Yeah, it would be good to know what kind of impact that really has if we were to implement some of those options, because
It would scare me not to implement some of those, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
And by the way, I didn't say this, but absolutely, whatever. If you said we've got a certain set of assumptions, of what if we go to this or that, Rocky can give you those numbers, and you absolutely should be looking at that before you make any final decisions.
I think kind of what I'd like to do, based on the discussion tonight, is to look at some of the recommendations for suggestions and actually do that, have that discussion and implement some if they make sense. And then, you know, what we can do is see how the plan performs. And you know, we won't know how it performs until we try a couple of those things. Let's see how it performs. We can follow back around and have this discussion in 6 months again if we need to, or 8 months, but we need to try a couple of things and see what the effect is, I guess. At least would be my recommendation.
Yeah,
Somebody
the
else on it?
dollars that we'd be looking at.
yeah.
And not only that, I'm also curious about the investment process as well.
Yeah,
We haven't
me
really
too.
mentioned that. I'd like to, 7% makes sense. I understand that in today's day and age, but that will fluctuate over the course of 20 years. There'll be times we'll be looking at 10%, as far as what people will think, and that's all an emotional realm.
And there may be times we're looking at a negative 10%.
Yeah, well, that can happen too. So I'd just be curious to know what their investment process is that we just selected on, and whether it's a target date program for each person or not. So
I'm sure Sam just wrote that down, and he will be working on that soon.
there you go.
is there a chance we could get copies of that presentation?
Oh, absolutely. I've got one sitting right here, so yeah, absolutely. We can get a copy of it.
Thank you, Chuck.
Actually, I think, Chuck, maybe the one I have is from our conference call. Is there one more recent? Make sure. You got the updated one?
The one that was on the slide, that was on on your monitors, I think that's the latest one, and that Sam has.
You could email that to us.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. City Clerk, if you would call the next item.
Discussion of cost estimate for Hopewell House, review of report from Precision Planning regarding estimate, discussion of funding sources for projects including community development block grant funds. Secretary.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Members of the City Council, you should have in front of you, as part of your packet, a green-colored report. We'll be speaking from this evening. Just a little background first before we get into the discussion of the report. The Hopewell House was a historic property that was bought last summer. the thought was to convert it eventually into a special events facility, community center, if you will. Subsequent to that purchase, staff identified that the city could use its allocation of community development block grant funds, which average about $56,000 per year over a 3-year contract period, which is about $170,000. Those funds could be used for a senior center. Rehabbing this building for a senior center would also provide the flexibility of allowing it to be used for community center after hours during the week, and certainly on the weekend, as well as for weddings and other special events on the weekends as well. So that seems to be a really good way of maximizing those funds to convert this building into such senior center. As part of the grant application for the CDBG grant, Fulton County, who administers these monies, has asked the city to provide a commitment letter to fund the remaining of the improvements necessary to create this senior center. In order to ascertain what the actual cost would be to renovate this building into a senior center, the city hired Precision Planning to undertake this. And thanks to Carter as well for his assistance in helping with this effort. We also asked Councilmember Lusk and his company estimator to review the cost estimate that was developed by Precision Planning. And we toured the facility, the building, this past Friday with the estimator from Mr. Lusk's company, and he felt that this was a good estimate. The estimate for the rehabilitation of this property totals approximately, again, this is just an estimate, but the cost is $699,000. Before we get into the discussion of the report, let me just go on to say that the other side of this, beside the rehabilitation costs, is the operating costs to operate this as a senior center. We have been working with the staff at Fulton County. Many of you may know that Fulton County operates senior centers throughout the county, and they fund various nonprofits to operate these centers. In North Fulton, the nonprofit is called Senior Services North Fulton. So we did ask the county to expand its operation from 3 centers to 4 centers to include a senior center in the city of Milton for this purpose. And we have been working with them to put money into the coming year's budget. And unfortunately, you have probably read the newspaper like I have in terms of the shortfall that's in front of Fulton County at this point. So we're not quite sure where that budget item will go. Senior Services North Fulton is certainly interested in running this center for us, whether we get the Cadillac, if you will, provided by Fulton County, or if we have to look at the Ford, so to speak, operation at the senior center. But Carrie Bellware from Senior Services North Fulton is in the audience tonight, and she certainly can speak to that. So that just gives you a little overview from the construction side, the capital improvement side, as well as the operating side. So we'd like to move forward with this, but we certainly need to get the council's thought and concurrence on the costs that are going to be needed, especially the city monies that would have to go in to creating this facility. So I'm happy to answer any questions on the report. Carter, in terms of the more technical questions on the cost estimate, are certainly available as well.
Who wants to start?
Mr. Mayor, if you don't have anybody jumping, I do have these comments from the Councilmember Lusk.
Sure, go ahead and read those.
If you want to.
Yeah, if you want to read those for the record, so go ahead.
This is from Councilmember Lusk, dated August the 10th. I would like to enter my comments into the discussion regarding this item, and have them as part of the consideration for the direction we need to take. Number one, we spent around $250,000 to purchase and preserve the Hopewell House for the use and enjoyment of the residents of Milton. Two, the house represents a true historical treasure worthy of being preserved and enjoyed by everyone. Three, certain improvements and maintenance need to be performed in order to achieve its legal use by the public. Structural and life safety issues need to be addressed before we can allow the general public to use the facility. This will require funding. In order to make this facility cost neutral or positive, to make it sustainable, it would require that we outfit it to serve the community for a variety of functions where revenue could be produced. For example, weddings, receptions, banquets, meetings, etc. Number five, in order to be adaptable for those uses, a commercial kitchen would be required. Access to the house, including all accessibility requirements under the ADA, would be required. Compliance with the Georgia Energy Code is mandatory. Six, the Mansell House in Alpharetta is used for all types of special events. There is not a commercial kitchen in that facility. Nevertheless, they were able to bring in $25,000 in revenue last year. I believe that we can perform the same service with the Hopewell House. 7, I have reviewed the cost estimate prepared by Precision Planning for the renovation and stabilization of the Hopewell House. I believe that it is adequate to achieve the requirements of the program for a senior center and event center. I believe that we can recoup the cost of renovation and realize enough to make the facility sustainable for the city. I recommend moving forward.
Well, well, we bought the facility to be able to use it and not to just put money into it so it wouldn't deteriorate. So I'm in favor of looking into this forward, moving forward with it.
If I can interject, I'll just tell because we're kind of being asked to provide a letter to guarantee funding in a budget that you all will see for the first time next week. That's kind of a cart before the horse proposition.
This was an old stagecoach.
Wow. I can tell you that the budget that we are going to present to you a week from today is prepared. It will probably have a couple of tweaks this week, but for all intents and purposes, there is a document that exists that I'm ready to bring forward next week, and it does have this. It does have a $529,000 placeholder in it. Whether or not you all will agree to adopt a final budget with that number in it is up to you. But the budget that you will see next week has a placeholder in that amount in it, and the budget is one I'm comfortable bringing forward to present to you.
I'd like to ask a question. Maybe Carter, what would be the process for this? Would, as far as actual construction, would you put this out to bid, or construction management, or what's your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question.
I would too.
Obviously, it would go out to bid. The delivery process that we would use, I think we would probably work through with the selected architect to see. The CM at risk is one that we're currently using under the public safety facility. And whether or not that would be applicable to a small project like this, I don't know. But it would be a process that would be bid, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's a roundabout way not to answer the question, I think.
My 2 cents, this would be better suited to a bid process than the CM at risk, I think, because of the size of it. Probably get smaller contractors that may be more competitive. I think this budget is, estimate is fine, but I think it probably, in today's marketplace could probably come in considerably cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I look at just the design and engineering fees of $74,000, so they, probably could tweak those down some too.
I think
Probably some
so.
hungry guys
That's been
out
my
there.
experience.
I think we always want to be going down with the numbers rather than up with the
I think
numbers.
this
so.
is a great budget, but I think it could certainly, if you get some competitiveness on it, it would come down.
I think maybe the only value, not maybe the only value, but one of the values of going with a CM at risk type process would be some of the unknowns that you get into with an older structure, particularly the internal structure, insulation, things like that we just don't know at this point. There is some value to that, but just depending on how much we do on the front end of the engineering and exploration, architectural work, probably would define which way we go from a delivery standpoint.
Sure. Lance?
As part of this study, of course, I just got this, did they do any hazardous material evaluations or anything like that? Or, because like you just said, you get into
you know, I don't know if there'd be asbestos, but lead paint, you know, those types of items.
It's historic lead paint.
Okay, that's fine.
I think it's historic lead paint.
Okay.
But I didn't see any asbestos, no wood floors, no roof. So I think probably the lead paint, and again, only moving parts.
Right. Right. And the, you said a block grant or something,
Yes, community block grant.
and that's how much?
It comes from HUD through Fulton
back,
County. Oh, yes, thank you. It's money that comes from HUD through Fulton County to us, and we are eligible to receive approximately $56,000 per year. And we've never been able to use it before because we've never had an eligible project. Senior Center is an eligible project.
Okay. And you say per year, would this be just a 1 year?
It would be
deal?
3 years. Fulton County contracts these grants over a 3-year period. So we could utilize the 3 years worth of our annual allocation. 56 times 3 is
So
approximately
theoretically,
170.
we get like about $170-some thousand.
Correct. Exactly right.
Get that in my head.
It's good.
I know.
That's what he used to do
Did
in
the
the job.
accumulator earlier,
Ate
and
my
I got the
weeds
same
this
number.
morning. Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Okay.
I'm in favor of going forward with the project. I agree that, we bought the house to do something with it, and I think the senior center, it's a good use for it, and I'm sure we will use it for other things in addition to just the senior center. And I also agree that, I think the cost is probably extremely conservative, and I hope we don't need a $75,000 kitchen in it, so.
Matt?
I may be the odd man out here. I just worry about this maybe being some black hole down in the future. And I agree with the reason why we bought it. I agree with the serving the seniors from a community standpoint. I just have concern that, you know, we're not going to make enough use of it to make it justify our budgeting and all that. I just want to make sure that that's the case, and I want to make sure that as a city, we've done our due diligence to see that other programs like this have succeeded in other cities and other communities as well, you know, without it being some kind of a loss leader. I just want to make sure that that's a path we have been down, and I don't know if that's the case yet. So if there's other examples that we can see of that, so we can help make these decisions and make this the best possible use. Otherwise, I would love to see at some point maybe, you know, passing this over to a foundation or something rather than be run by the city itself as another alternative in the future. I'm just thinking out loud.
Okay, makes sense.
One last point too, and again, I'm looking at some of the concepts and always looking at things in terms of design. Done similar projects like this.
The
you
one
know,
that's in Virginia?
Yeah, the ones in Virginia, the one where the Olympic gymnast is from, you know, that, you know. Anyway. Anyway, you know, incorporating also in the design, some nice gardens, things like that.
Oh, yes, yes, and our thought is to use the community garden groups. We'd like to put in some raised planting beds to be used by the seniors, as well as other community garden.
Yeah, I'm also
type
talking
of-
about ornamental gardens too, because if you're using it for weddings and other special events, that will really help, you know, draw people to.
Yes,
to
there's
the,
already a formal garden on, just to the one side of the house that
Right.
really needs to be
Right.
brought over. And I've already actually talked to our arborist about that,
Right,
yes.
good, because I think that would really be good to help us get some money back in usage fees.
Right, right.
Joe?
Yeah, I mean, we did decide on this a year ago that it was a property that was worth investing in, and I hate to see everything get distilled down to dollars and cents, and operating something like this, making it available to the city, can't look at it as just, you know, it's got to be revenue neutral or revenue positive or whatever. And Matt, I certainly appreciate, you know, the fact that you don't want to have something that you invest a lot of money in terms of refurbishing, and it's impossible to ever see a return on it. But you know, the city, you know, like most Parks and Rec programs, you know, they're there for the citizens, and it's part of the payback that the citizens get for being citizens and paying their taxes and things. So I hope we don't distill this down to just, how much money can we make on renting it out, because I can tell you now, we won't ever make enough to pay for everything, the upkeep and everything else, so. But I think it's worth looking into a little bit more. I think your comments are, certainly well-founded there, Matt, but I think it's something we need to keep looking at.
If I could respond just real quickly,
Yeah,
because
go ahead,
we did do a little bit of looking into comparable type facilities, and I'll tell you that what we found is there are really not many alike animals here, and there's a lot of event spaces. There's a lot of event spaces in older facilities, and when you look at what they are able to charge versus their booked up rate versus type of events and stuff, it's all over the board. And one of the things that emerged that caused it to be all over the board was whether or not we would allow the service of alcohol. As we found, because those facilities that would allow alcohol at a wedding reception were booked up for weddings, and those that didn't were not booked up for weddings. So there's things that we have to look at as we figure out, what type of programming goes on in there that might be revenue positive if we're willing to make some of those types of decisions that would make it become, quote, more attractive. And then how that works with our overflow parking being potentially a Baptist church. We got to think of all these things to figure out what's going to make that building successful. I'll push go on fixing it, or we'll hold off if we need to hold off. I come from the thought process that it's an asset owned, and an asset owned should be invested in before a new asset is either built or not. And this is one that we've owned now, and I'll certainly sit down with you at your leisure. We can go through some of the stuff we looked at in getting to the decision that we got to. But to sit here and say that I think it's going to be a revenue positive, even a revenue, I can't even get to revenue neutral in the short term. Revenue positive, no way. Councilmember Longoria is absolutely right there. But it is an asset we own. It's a gem in the community, and one that, we finally found an opportunity to potentially use our CDBG funds. These block grant funds have been sitting around since 2006. Every year we've been a city, and we have not had a program we could use them on because we don't have, we weren't able to demonstrate a program that served low and moderate income folks. And seniors, just by their very nature, although I have found out people often think that they are just presumed low and mod. They are not, but we have done enough research to realize that even Milton seniors do qualify. So this is the first opportunity really to tap into some money that we've been leaving on the table. And if there's an opportunity to tap into that and to bring that $699,000 very, very, very probably conservative number down, my gut tells me that now is the time we need to get it done and get it open. That's what my gut's telling me is the right recommendation to make.
And I think it's great that, we have an opportunity to use it with senior services too. So it's something that we're lacking here in the city, so that'll be great too.
And I would say honestly, there's a lot of people from the campaign, et cetera, that were just questioning the purchase of it. Not necessarily saying that we can go back on it. We can't. We've got that down there. But if we're going to do it, we got to do it right, and make sure that we need to do a good job of selling that to the community so that it is getting used. And we do need to make sure that if we are going to do it, that it's the best darn senior house that we have in the whole region, if we do that. But, the costs, et cetera, are going to be pretty high. We got to figure out from a priority standpoint how much we want to put into this thing. And I think that since we have it, we have to. It's just, in my mind, I think that I'd love to see as much use of it as possible. If we're going to do it, we got to do everything we can to make it work. If we don't, though, I'd love to see, other alternatives, just make sure that we know exactly what we're doing. Have foundations run houses like this before, if that's the case. I think they have. I just want to know, can they do it well as well? Should we be doing it philosophically? And that may be a debate we have to have as well, if we didn't already have it in the purchase of it. I don't know. So those are just questions I have.
Karen?
My only question is there a way for a city-owned property, something like this, to be for a special event facility to serve alcohol? So there are ways that we can do that, because like you said, it makes a big difference in whether or not it's.
The ones it's funny, but the ones that we've seen successful and booked for events are ones that have established a policy by which they allow the service of.
And I'm sure it's very strict guidelines. It's not, a wild party there every night for the seniors, but it's strict guidelines.
I don't want city staff there as bartenders, I'll tell you that. But,
I just conjured up a good picture.
Well, and
Sell growlers.
to take everybody's comments and Matt's and everybody else's, I think Matt's got a good point. We've got to communicate very well with our citizens the value of this. It's not a one, we're going to spend a lot of money the first year, but as Joe said, it's over time, we've got to communicate that over the next 20 years, our city's going to get a lot of value out of it. And certainly by that time, we'll hopefully have gotten our money out of it, and the citizens got some use out of it. So.
The other thing I want to be mindful of is that if the senior services funding doesn't make it through, it's one thing, just like our budget. It's one thing to be in a budget document somewhere. It's a second to be in the budget document that the commission says yes to. I mean, that's two totally different things. If that funding goes away and if that program is not able to be delivered in this facility, some of this work that we've done with Precision might automatically get scaled back because we might not automatically think that this is a design and a program that deals with the stated function. Now, if we don't have the stated function in the way we thought we were going to have it, now this plan might change some. So I don't see any plan though that has anything happen to it but a decreasing in scope. That's what's on that paper that Precision did is kind of like the far end of what would be out there. Everything else is further in a decreasing scope. So we'll have to, even if you all agree to us issuing that letter confirming that we're willing to fund, we obviously will have to watch Fulton County's budget process evolve over the next. I don't think they can deficit spend anymore because I think their reserves are where they are. So we'll just have to watch and see what gets slashed.
Right.
Joe,
Yeah, go ahead.
can we, in these types of projects too, can there be corporate sponsorships of projects like this?
That would be included.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. City has full
So we-
authority to accept donations, sponsorships. Yes.
Right. And then also, is there other, grant money available? I know I did in Georgia, senior center, a couple. In Oconee County, at Senior Center, and they got I think a $1 million grant from the federal, I think it was from the state or from the federal government. It was a matching grant, although.
Well, we can certainly look into that.
And that was for a much larger facility,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah,
And
but
this
still,
was from a ground-up facility. It wasn't a restoration. But they did get, I think, if I recall correctly, $1 million towards a project that was like a $8 million project total. Because it wasn't just the senior center, it was other things too. And Taylor Bronner House, check there in Smyrna. That's a really nice facility, historic. It used to be a mental institution. I didn't attend all that. But that's a really nice facility. They use it for, it's in Smyrna, and it's a Taylor Bronner House, and they love it. It really turned out nice. It has a separate facility, and a smaller house, that was a doctor's house, and then the main, what was the hospital. But you see how they're using it, what type of usage fees they're using it in Woodstock as well, the Magnolia House in Woodstock. I've been to there. It's a nice, I think, facility they're using for a senior center. It had been, in fact.
Okay. Sounds like we've got support to move forward, Chris. And when we look at our budget, we can certainly discuss this more and individually, or as an individual item as to whether we go forward or not. But at this point, it sounds like the will of the council is to move forward. All right.
Okay.
You want to call the next item?
Oh, yes, I do.
Well, Kathy's still up here.
Maybe I do. Where is it? Here we go. Sorry. The next item is RZ 1211 to amend Article 16 signs as it relates to moving signs and replacing the current name Crabapple Crossroads Overlay District signs to Crabapple Form-Based Code Overlay District signs. Kathy Field.
Thank you. There's two parts to RZ 12-11. The first part relates to moving signs. And we realized when we changed the sign ordinance that we really didn't address the moving signs, i.e. the people who are standing in our right-of-way with signs and flipping them around and whatnot. And also those people who are dressed up in a way that advertises a business. And I guess the best one is the Liberty tax guy who's dressed up as the
Uncle Sam,
or the Statue of Liberty.
or Statue of Liberty, yes.
So in order to eliminate those from our right-of-ways, we are proposing two changes to the text. And incidentally, I'm working off memos that are in your August 20th packages. Save paper. I'm told that since it's the same memo, that if you would go into the August 20th package. And you'll find two memos, and they're actually the same. One addresses the first text amendment, and the second addresses the second, but they're both the same, actually. So, having said that, I'm on page 1, and we're proposing a change to the definition of sign, and we propose that it be changed to the following language. Sign means any device, fixture, placard, or structure affixed to, supported by, or suspended by a stationary or moving object, building or the ground, or held or worn by a person or animal that uses any color, form, graphic, illumination, symbol, costume, or writing to communicate information of any kind to the public. And then to go along with that change to the sign definition on the following page, you'll see under section 64-2295 under prohibited signs and devices, changes to subsection 2 so that it reads as follows: signs held or worn by a person or animal except during demonstrations, assemblies, and public gatherings. So that whole new sentence would actually go in there. What's in yellow is the result of a review by the Planning Commission in terms of their request that those words be put in there. So those two changes essentially comprise our proposed text amendments for RZ 12-11.
Joe?
Kathy, did we solicit any feedback from the business owners in the Crabapple area about this? Because I'm just a little bit sensitive, since they showed up in force at one of our meetings, we're asking for help, and businesses have been bad, and they need signage to make people aware of their businesses. Now, I'm not necessarily one of those guys who loves to see, the pizza guy twirling his sign and all that stuff, but if it has a material impact on their business, do they think this is a good idea?
Yeah, not specifically. I know we advertised, and we always have our community meetings, but there was no.
To be honest, I don't think we have a lot of this issue or problem.
Yeah.
Per se.
Well, and that,
Yeah.
Can I just interrupt just real quick and say the reason we're moving forward with this is because Alphareta's prohibited it, and their code enforcement folks are pushing the sign twirlers into Milton. They're for Alphareta businesses pushing the sign twirlers across Windward Parkway. So, and it's only because they're prohibited south of Windward Parkway, just not north of it.
But is this just for Crabapple?
No, the whole city.
Oh, maybe I misunderstood.
Quite
I thought it was
Yeah, that's
Crabapple
nice.
only.
Yeah.
Quite
No.
distracting, and we know where Great Clips is without a twirling sign.
If I may respond, Councilman Longoria, there are two parts to this RZ, and I forgive me in that there are two parts. The first part deals with the moving signs. The second part of this text amendment is a cleanup in that we're taking out the words the Crabapple Crossroads Overlay District and putting in Crabapple Form-Based Code,
Okay,
which is
all
just
right.
a cleanup.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So
I read
that's-
it too
and I
fast. It looked like
apologize.
this was just
Yes.
specific to Crabapple. That's
No,
why I
no,
said
there
Crabapple.
are actually two separate issues that got combined
Okay.
into one text amendment.
Crabapple and the twirling sign,
Yeah.
two separate ones.
Yes,
Okay.
two separate ones. So that's where you're coming from, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, yeah. All right, so we didn't solicit any feedback from business owners, is the answer to the question, right?
They had the opportunity.
Yeah, we have a public participation process and an advertising process that does do that. but we did not hear from anyone.
Okay, so
And-
Chris made a good point. You guys doing the pizza stuff and all over on our corner. It was because Alpharetta pushed them over there.
That's right.
Right, yeah, what you've got is Liberty Tax people that as long as they're not carrying a sign, they are legal in Alpharetta because they have defined it as the sign conveying a message, which is why you'll watch them walk around without a sign during the week and you'll see them with a sign on the weekend. Then you have the Great Clips and the Little Caesars guy that are two Alpharetta businesses in the Kroger Shopping Center that just make sure that they stand on the Milton side of Highway 9 just north of Winter Parkway because they're at this point they're legal. The other one that you will see is down at, you used to see it down near that, that fast foody Japanese chicken place. I forget what it's called. Down by Radio Shack.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that you'd find them standing. That's a Milton business. You find them standing just off of the right of way. They had almost worked it out so they could stand on a public utility spot where they knew they could be there with their twirling sign. So we're trying to just button up a loophole that's been found that currently exists. We don't have any other sign twirlers anywhere else in Milton other than the ones that are pushed here from Alpharetta.
And we haven't had any complaints or anything driving this, have we?
Well, yeah, the planning commission has received some complaints, and actually, I get complaints from the code enforcement officers in the sense that they really can't enforce this.
Yeah, I just want to point out, Joe made, it doesn't sound like it's affecting any of our businesses right now, but, do we want to enact something that, would hurt business? Maybe not, but it's, I'm toying with that too. Are we?
But it would affect like when the Chick-fil-A cow's out there doing
That's
its
an
thing. Well, it says animals can't do it
Yeah,
either.
well, we included animals
I mean,
in
so
here.
that would
That's
affect
right.
them.
That's right.
Or, I mean, and I don't think we would take it to this level, but when somebody's having a car wash at a place that they're holding signs out there, how does that, I mean, I know,
We're not going to enforce that.
That's usually on weekends for the code
It's
enforcement.
just the professional sign twirlers.
well, Lance may try to
And the,
take
Liberty-
it.
I might. I might.
I mean, Chris, is there any statistics that say those types of signs are dangerous to people driving, they get distracted, anything like that? I don't think there is, but.
I haven't seen anything, no.
Is this something that we feel, that we need to pursue immediately, or is this something that, I mean, it's kind of up to council, I don't know if you guys want to.
Well, I don't like the idea though of the Alpharetta people being pushed over to our corner just because they know they can get away with it in Milton and can't in Alpharetta. That, I'll be
Yeah,
honest with you, that
that's
bothers me.
annoying.
Unless when their lease comes up, they move to a facility in
Right,
Milton.
right, they can throw a sign.
Yeah.
Hot dog.
Because the problem is that it doesn't really matter where they are because nobody knows what the city limit lines are anyway.
We'll make sure we
That's
tell
right.
them.
Good point.
Nobody
Especially
knows
right there
where
at
the
that
city-
intersection,
Yeah.
you know, as well.
Well, I mean, I think obviously we need to change the wording in the crab apple, clean that up, but in my opinion, on the other, I mean, we could easily bring this up if it's an issue later.
Yeah, I would agree too.
Would this affect, since my wife did this on the corner campaigning,
No.
people, no,
I think campaigning is eliminated.
That's a different-
Or it's excluded.
okay,
So my dog can still wear t-shirts.
because Karen Lee would really be
As I'm
upset.
capturing this, y'all are interested in replacing the credible thing, but you are not interested in regulating moving signs.
I like the idea of regulating them. Like I said, I don't like the idea of them coming from Alpharetta because they feel like they get away with it in Milton. So I would be interested in regulating them, so.
Right now, I'm not for it.
Not for it,
I'm not.
You're not for,
I'm not for regulating the signs right now.
Okay.
We've already done
Neither
that.
am I.
all right, we're not for it, or
Okay.
majority
Wow.
said that.
All right.
But then we still need crab apple
Okay.
signs.
Fair enough.
I gotta get next week for signs.
All right, you've got one last item, which is RZ 1212, to amend section 64-2371 to create permit expiration standards for land disturbing activities.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, at your meeting last month, you passed an ordinance regulating a time limit for the building permits. And I must say that we've already had success with that.
Thank you.
We realized at the time, though, that we did not draft language to do the same thing i.e. to have an expiration time frame for land disturbance permit activities. So this text change is to address that issue. And we have created a new section, which is section 64-2371, entitled Permit Expiration for Land Disturbing Activities. And it reads as follows. Permits for land disturbing activities shall be valid for 2 years. Work must begin within 180 days of issuance of the permit, or the permit shall expire. Permits for projects which have achieved substantial completion may be extended at the discretion of the Director of Community Development, not to exceed 1 additional year from the expiration date of the permit, provided that the permit holder issues a performance bond equal to 125% of the estimated cost of the completion of the project. And when we talk about project here, project is defined as the land disturbance infrastructure, not the building project, okay? So that is the proposed change to the ordinance to allow for a time frame for land disturbance, for an expiration date.
Anybody have any comments, Karen?
I've got just one question. A lot of times we will have conditions along with the zoning that require them to do certain things at the completion of the project and all.
Right.
Can we limit those to a specific time frame so that, you know, if they were doing some kind of plantings and stuff, that would have to be done, you know, within a year's period of time, so that they would have to get that part of the project complete? Because I know, you know, what we don't want is something to look like a construction site for 3 or 4 years, which we do have some of those in Milton that have looked like a construction site for 3 or 4 years. But can we limit the time that they have in those conditions for certain zonings or certain variances and things, so that it can keep from being a construction project type look?
Yeah, maybe Robin could weigh in this too, but I know a lot of the stuff, like putting the second coat on the roads, for instance, they wait till the end usually because of the construction. There's lots of things that they wait for the end. But we can, I think it's, even Carter, I mean, there's good monitoring that goes on along the way. And the idea is we don't want to be caught short at the end with a project where a developer has walked off and he's left it, so that there is nothing, that there are improvements yet to be done that have not been done anyway. So
I mean, what I was thinking of, some of it was some of the stuff that we require as far as the plantings and things like that, that they don't do until the end of a project, but yet until that is done, you know, it does look like a construction.
Well, I can certainly talk to Jimmy Sanders, who oversees that. I mean, I think a lot of that is really due to the fact that because you've got trucks and traffic in there and everything.
Sometimes it is, but I think, you know, the project I'm probably speaking about, and there's ways that could have been done.
Yeah.
Because it is not where an entrance or anything is.
Yeah, and so we need to be better mindful of that, is really what you're saying.
So that we can limit the time periods when we put conditions on things, or variances are granted for fences and stuff like that, to make sure they are completed in a specific time.
Yeah, if we have the leverage, certainly, with rezoning. When we're doing a plan of approval, we can certainly write that in. So there are ways of doing that, certainly, to address that concern.
Kathy, someone behind.
Yeah, Robin wants to mention something.
I was going to comment that in general, every zoning, before they receive their certificate of occupancy, they have to complete every condition within the zoning requirement condition.
Right.
So that's one thing. But I think I agree with Kathy. If we want a sunset rule like we did at rezoning the Birmingham Highway for the Little house, that we needed some things done on the other side of Birmingham Highway, so we gave a time limit for it to be done. So we've definitely done that.
Okay.
The only thing I maybe get Ken's comments on that, because I totally understand, but you know, you do have projects where, and like Robin said, you know, it's one thing to hold up the CO before you know they finish it, but to put time limits on, you know, unfortunately, what if you have a project that either because of budgets or funding, and you know, people don't have it done, which is same. It's a catch-22.
Yeah.
How can you force someone to spend their money faster?
Well, I
just
mean, the
because of an
project I'm
imposed
thinking
date?
about is they had gotten a variance for a a fence, but yet they, it's been
With
4
all that
years
stuff.
and they still have a chain link fence up because the project is not complete yet. And so that, they've gotten this variance to put in a different kind of fence, but yet they haven't put that in, they haven't done any of the plantings, and it looks like a
Yeah.
construction site.
Right. Well, I think these time limits, both for the building permit and now for the land disturbance, will really go a long way toward alleviating
Joe.
those really very bad instances.
Okay, Lance?
Right now, for time limits, like for building permit, is that correct?
Pardon me?
Is there a time limit for building permits?
Yes, we just
Is there
instituted
a
that.
mechanism that they can file a request for an extension?
Yes.
Okay, so the same thing could
Yes.
happen here.
Yes.
Put a time limit, but if there's mitigating
There's a
circumstances.
good reason, that's right.
Good
I
reason,
have the
you can go and
authority.
ask for an extension.
Right.
And then, of course, for, land disturbing activities, there are certain things that there's, like silt fence and things like that, that has to remain until, stabilization has occurred, although they're supposed to stabilize, because I know you have some of these subdivisions that have gone, they're homes for laterals, sewer laterals, not anything else, and, all that remains and really needs to remain because of state and federal requirements. So there are certain things that have to remain.
Oh, yeah.
Right, there are certain things to do, but I think.
Right. Yeah, I know. She's talking about
concerns or
actual
other
improvements
things
and
some
things like that.
landscaping that could be,
Mhm.
more
Right.
forthcoming.
Right.
To pretty the site up, so to speak.
Anybody else?
No.
Okay.
I like the idea.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm okay with it.
Okay.
There's a mechanism for, you can file a request for an extension.
Yes,
If there's certain things required.
correct.
Okay. And then this, the last item we had, we're going to defer until the open meetings and open records for our next work session. Councilmember Lusk had requested that, so I figure we'll wait till he's here. And that's it, it's a wrap.